Gawain laughed with relief seeing the train of wagons and civilians arriving at their fledgling camp at the foot of the mountains. Sir Philip led the column and saluted as they drew near. Gawain returned the gesture with a hearty wave. He smiled. Sir Philip's timing is impeccable. Finally, our manpower problem will be solved. With more labour, they could finish the construction of the pier and the sawmill. Then they could consider officially opening the mines in the east, and he could finally develop this camp into a territory. Civilians filed into the camp. Gawain, Rebecca, and Heidi welcomed them, passing friendly greetings to each of them coming in. He even had some of the freemen pass bread and water down the line for those who were weary from the journey. Sir Philip and a handful of soldiers stood before Rebecca, Dame Heidi, and Gawain. After some brief pleasantries, the nobles led the new arrivals through the camp. The young Viscountess bounced, clearly elated at the new arrivals. "Your arrival is perfect, Sir Philip. We have yet to encounter any monsters or wild animals, but the presence of the soldiers will help our people feel more at ease." Sir Philip nodded, his gaze fixed upon the camp around him. "It's only been a few days, but I must say I'm astonished with how complete the camp is. You've already made carpenter sheds and are starting on a smithy." Heidi grinned gratefully at Gawain. "Why, yes, and some civilian homesteads have even been built." The young knight continued to stare dumbfounded. He expected a few slipshod tents and maybe a ramshackle fence at most, not to arrive at a fledgling town that was only built in a few days. His eyes darted from worker to worker. "Where are the supervisors?" Rebecca pointed. "Over there." Philip followed her finger, and he noticed the clan's warriors, who usually stood beside the labourers with whips, carried boards to record progress. Occasionally, they even set aside their slates and helped the workers with more onerous tasks. Dame Heidi, Gawain, and Rebecca shared gratified looks as Sir Philip continued to puzzle over what he was seeing. Heidi's voice broke his stupefaction. "Isn't it incredible? I too never expected we could get them to work so diligently with these measures. The serfs have even started training each other in their spare time, so they can become good at tasks they're insufficient at." Sir Philip looked over. "Measures? What measures?" Heidi gestured at Gawain. "The Grand Duke has invented new rules for work." Sir Philip nodded knowingly. He cast appraising eyes at Gawain. "So you influenced the lazy serfs and civilians with a knight's sense of honour and virtue, eh?" Heidi cut the knight off. "No, Sir Philip. He gave them meat. It turns out it's easier to get someone to work if they know that it will benefit their lives." As she said this, she lamented about how she tried to implement similar reward systems before, but hadn't been able to track progress. Gawain had made it into a process where the valuable really were rewarded, and no one could cheat the system. She also learned for the first time that serfs and civilians were not born to be dumb and lazy. Gawain clapped Sir Philip's shoulder. "Good work. The people are all here. Let the soldiers and the people take a break first. After lunch, all the workers will gather in the open area in the centre of the camp. Heidi will tell them the rules of working here. Soldiers, including the militia, will gather at the west side of the camp. Sir Byron will be giving out some new gear." Then he turned to Heidi. "Don't worry about sorting the newcomers into their teams on the first day. The new rules will be too much for them to remember all at once." Dame Heidi nodded. Sir Philip cocked his head. "New gear? What new gear?" Gawain looked at him, giving a mysterious smile. "I'm not going to spoil the surprise just yet." Once lunch was ended, and Sir Philip had a gander at the new equipment, he was speechless. Gawain had implied that it would be good, but not this good. He thought that they would at most just be getting a batch of new swords and armour, or at the very most have everyone issued with a crossbow. But who would have thought that they would be getting a full set of enchanted equipment, enchanted swords, enchanted armour, and the crystals used by the army back in the ancient empire? There were long swords enchanted with sharpness flickered with cold white light. There were chainmail hauberks carved with elemental resistance seals, and lightness gave a faint grey lustre under the sunlight. They were light, and somehow Sir Philip could already tell that they could resist even the toughest of blows. The ill-educated soldiers had probably never seen what enchanted weapons looked like, but when they realised what they were, They were all unusually excited. As Sir Byron passed out the armour and weapons, Sir Philip asked the question that was on his mind. "You're passing out a set to everyone, Sir Byron?" The wizened knight nodded. "Surely these must be worth a fortune. How can we afford to hand out such prized possessions like they're nothing?" Gawain strode up, answering his question with mirth barely contained in his voice. "They're all antiques, Sir Philip. We need to use them now so they don't degrade sitting in storage. To be honest, we found many more in the mountains, but they had either lost their magical power or been ground to dust over the centuries." Sir Philip stammered. "Enchanted weapons and armour. There were barely any of them in Cecil territory for hundreds of years, and now we hand them out like candy." Amber giggled, playing with an enchanted dagger. "You silly knight. He's 700 years old. What old man doesn't stash a bunch of money in his mattress for later?" Gawain rolled his eyes and grabbed Amber by the ear, dragging her off. "Let me go! Haven't you heard that elves have very sensitive ears?" Gawain tossed her away from the soldiers. "So you remember you're an elf again?" Sir Philip called after Amber as Gawain dragged her away. "Our clan believes in care, the god of warriors and knights. We never keep things for ourselves." Gawain nodded at Sir Philip. This man's a true believer, a useful person to have as long as he stays honourable. Sir Philip suddenly stood up straight and saluted Gawain. "Grand Duke, may I request permission to bring blueprints to Tanzan Town? With Clan Leslie's assistance, we can start making weapons like these from scratch." Gawain shook his head. "There's no way to reproduce them, I'm afraid. They drew their power from the Azure Fount and were crafted using the Gondolian Empire's finest methods. Such knowledge was lost even before the Dark Wave. Magic power from mortal sources doesn't have enough potency for such tasks." Sir Philip nodded gravely. "So every time the magic is lost from one of these enchanted items, there is no way to replace it?" Gawain nodded. "Yes, we will need to make quality equipment ourselves one day, but that day will come." Regardless of what was to come, he had to smile as though he was a knight who was very confident of the future. Besides, Gawain was really quite confident. As long as the Dark Wave did not break out of nowhere, there was still room to maneuver. Just then, from the corner of his eye, he saw another small figure running towards him. Gawain whirled around to face the new arrival. It was Betty, the maid. She stopped before Gawain, her flaxen hair blowing all about her head like an unkempt cat. She panted and looked up at Gawain. "Lord, the Countess Rebecca seeks you." Gawain nodded. "What matter is it now?" Betty paused. She furrowed her brow. "I forgot!" Gawain buried his face in his hand. Why couldn't this girl remember anything besides cooking? Gawain shook his head and thought it was already a consolation that the little girl could remember who she was supposed to call, and that he should not demand too much of her. A quarter of an hour later, Gawain and Amber found Rebecca, who was waiting at the other side of the camp. She stood beside several wheelbarrows filled with grey rocks of varying sizes. Gawain let out a triumphant shout. Amber poked her head in the wheelbarrows. "What? Rebecca, you didn't call your ancestor over just to have a look at some rocks?" Rebecca and Gawain laughed. Gawain patted Amber on the head. "Oh, you silly elfling. Fetch the blacksmiths. It looks like Clan Cecil finally has some iron again." The smithy was still very much a work in progress. Gawain referred to it as a smithy, even though what he envisioned was far more complicated than a medieval-style blacksmith. As he stared at the partially completed wooden structure, Gawain thought of a name for it: Cecil Steelworks. Fortunately, the blacksmith of Clan Cecil, Old Hummel, had survived the incursion of monsters. He was in charge of the project, and had many opinions about Gawain's plans. "This is taking up a ton of land, my lord. How can such a large facility be called a smithy?" Gawain nodded thoughtfully, taking in the objections calmly. The best thing about having old-timers is that they dared to speak their mind where younger people might hold their tongues. "Trust me, Hummel, it will all make sense eventually." As this smithy took up such a large area, it could only be located at the eastern edge of the camp, and its large courtyard extended all the way to the undeveloped land outside. On a map, it would appear like a giant lump protruding from the neat wooden fences, in a slightly comical manner. At this moment, the smithy only contained one furnace and was mostly empty space, hence old Hummel's objections. But Gawain had plans. He was envisioning future production capacities. After all, a traditional smithy like the kind old Hummel was accustomed to needed only one master smith with several apprentices. To explain all this would raise far too many questions, so Gawain relied upon the trust that he had gained in the workers by his 3 revolutionary edicts. Once Rebecca brought the first shipment of iron, Gawain joined her, Hummel and Hummel's apprentices at the incomplete structure. The apprentices were a gaggle of about a dozen boys and girls, each surprisingly fit for their age, and all watched Gawain with a singular awe. They knew that this hero of legend had already rewritten their world, and he had only begun. Gawain went straight to the traditional furnace. At first glance, this oven was slightly odd-looking. It was about 3 feet tall and looked like a stovepipe resting on a dome. The bottom had a door meant for feeding in fuel, and the top had a place in which one would feed ores for smelting. Gawain found nothing unusual about this, but what he was not used to seeing were the 3 runes carved along the furnace's side. Each rune was carved on a black stone slab, carefully polished and placed in equidistant portions. The lowest was triangular with a wavy line splitting the triangle. The stone in the middle was a square with a diamond etched within, and the top one was a spiral. Gawain Cecil's memories told him what these meant: fire, earth and air, respectively. The furnace seemed to glitter in the daylight, as if it was dusted by a sparkling substance. Gawain recognized it as quartz sand, a cheap but effective magical conductor. Gawain turned toward old Hummel. "You made this furnace?" The old blacksmith hopped forward. The elderly man was a wall of muscle, even at his advanced age. His skin seemed permanently scorched from years at the forge, and his eyes squinted out of habit, as if expecting sparks to fly at him at all times. He removed his hat and bowed toward Gawain. Yes. Well, to be precise, I made one half and my apprentices finished it." Gawain nodded. He beckoned Rebecca over and spoke under his breath. "Can the blacksmiths use magic, even though they are civilians?" Rebecca laughed. "Oh, of course not. They don't have the training we get as mages. But each trade does have secrets, and smiths learn runes to help them along in their work, passively. It's not like casting a fireball. It's more like setting a spell that amplifies things around you." Gawain nodded, understanding. Even a little weak power harnessed through some carefully carved symbols could make all the difference. This was something that separated Lauren from Earth. It was just like the 1 degree Celsius between 99 and 100, the degree that makes the water boil. He knew there must be some way to harness this power to bring about greater efficiency. Gawain spoke again, making sure to play the part. He spoke to Hummel this time. "In my age of youth, I knew little of smithing. Could you explain these runes?" Old Hummel cleared his throat. "Well, with these runes, this furnace only needs firewood as fuel. The magic amplifies the heat without the use of bellows. If we had stronger material than quartz, like crystal or mithril, we could even use straw and produce the same effect." He spoke proudly, and Gawain nodded. Another way magic could be useful, but it has become a crutch for those who might innovate otherwise. Gawain didn't voice these thoughts aloud, but returned to examining the furnace before him. Hummel eyed him, nervously. He was starting to wonder if he had said something wrong. He knew royals were powerful and moody, and he had no wish to get on their wrong side. His apprentices nudged each other, impressed by their master's dignity while standing next to a hero of legend. But the blacksmith's thoughts were distracted by Gawain's next question. "How much iron can you produce every day with such a furnace, given a guaranteed sufficient supply of ores?" Hummel puffed up his chest. "With the kinds of ores the Viscountess just brought, we can make just over 55 pounds of iron a day." Gawain frowned. Hummel cocked his head. "My lord, is that not sufficient? I'm not questioning my lord's judgment, but—" Gawain shook his head and waved his hand. "Don't worry about my status when you talk to me, Hummel. My task as Grand Duke is to protect you, not abuse you." The old smith nodded, still befuddled. His apprentices even watched, fascinated by the ambiguous reactions from Gawain. "You see, my lord, the space inside the furnace is quite limited. After each batch, it needs to rest for an hour before the runes can cool down. That's why we cannot make more than 50 pounds a day. Gawain furrowed his brow. The runes need to cool? Hummel nodded. Yes, you see, while the fire runes channel power, they can also break the stone upon which they're carved. That's why we use black stones. But the hotter it burns, the more likely it is to break the rune and render the furnace useless. That's why we cannot burn it constantly. Gawain put his hands on his hips, befuddled by the inefficiency. Can you not make the furnace bigger? Hummel shrugged, becoming more nervous at these probing questions that struck the very heart of his trade. The rune can only provide so much fire. The larger the furnace, the more powerful runes needed to keep the flame hot. Gawain nodded, stroking his chin. He clicked his fingers. That's it then. The runes are actually limiting production. He turned away from the still confused blacksmith and faced Rebecca. Do you think you could change the runes? Rebecca grimaced involuntarily. Gawain sighed. Maybe we should just summon Dame Heidi. Rebecca flushed crimson. My Lord Ancestor, just because I can't make spell molds doesn't mean I don't know the theory. Gawain held up his arms in surrender. All right then. With your theoretical knowledge, how should we solve this problem? Rebecca sat cross-legged and stared at the runes. Since you said the runes are what's keeping the furnace from working as best as it could, we can replace the runes. Gawain raised his eyebrows. What with? Rebecca pinched the bridge of her nose, straining to recall her scholastic knowledge. The runes themselves are functioning very simply. They just raise the temperature, control the airflow, and work out impurities. If we use real magic circles instead of runes, then the furnaces should run smoothly, with no need to stop and start. She looked up at her ancestor, with a triumphant look on her face. Gawain put a finger to his lips pensively. Could we carve a magic circle on each furnace? Rebecca's face fell. Oh! Gawain looked over. What? Well, it wouldn't work in practice. Aunt Heidi and I can carve the magic circles, but that amount of magic cannot be channeled passively. You need to continuously maintain it with your own magic. Gawain's gaze drifted over to old Hummel and his several apprentices. The smiths and smiths in training were hanging on every word, as if they knew that the fate of their very profession rested in the balance. Gawain grunted to himself. Another reason this world is held back. They rely upon magic, and then keep tradesmen from being able to use it. Another hurdle fell between Cecil Clan and Gawain's lofty ambitions. Rebecca's reasoning was simple. Even if she could create a magic circle for the blacksmith, ordinary people could not control it at will. They would need to stay by the forge and keep the magic circles powered. It was the same as driving a race car. Without engineers to run maintenance and change the tires, the driver could only take the vehicle so far. Rebecca explained with a serious expression. Carving magic circles on the furnaces already limited their efficiency. Plus, even Aunt Heidi's best magic circles are only grade 2. The matrix of a small magic circle also cannot sustain itself. It has to be as big as a tent to draw magical power from the air and stay active. Gawain knew from memory that there was no shortage of complicated theories regarding magic circles. In terms of scale, they were generally classified into small, medium, large, and mega sizes. Small magic circles were carved onto armor and weapons, enchanting them with magical power. From what Gawain could recall, the two largest magic circles were built by the elves, one northward in the city of 1,000 towers in the Violet Kingdom, and another southward in the Stars' sacred temple. The roads of the cities were the etchings of the magic circle. Beyond scale, magic circles also had different degrees of complexity. Their matrices were either self-powered or externally powered. Self-powered circles had complicated absorption systems that allowed them to take magical power embedded in the natural world to power themselves. However, because this magical power was scarce outside of dense concentrations of magic, self-powered circles had to be large in size. Even then, as Rebecca said, they were hardly ever efficient. As such, mages always preferred to power the magic circles themselves rather than craft self-powered ones. Gawain scratched his chin and observed the furnace. Must the symbols be carved directly on the furnaces in order to power them? And must all the functions be placed into one magic circle? Rebecca blinked in confusion. What would be the other option? Gawain felt he was getting closer to understanding the core of how magic was used in this world. People brute forced their way using raw mana. They focused on using it to cut corners and achieve specific tasks. But no one ever considered how to use magic in more extensive and, frankly, simpler ways. Gawain grabbed a stick and sketched out a blueprint on the ground. Carve a self-powered large magic circle and let it take in magical power from the environment. Then, create a channel between its matrix so that it could power other, smaller magic circles. When the connection is cut off, we design the large magic circle so that it releases the magical power on its own, so it doesn't overflow. Rebecca nodded, slowly understanding it. So you're saying we should use different magic circles with different functions. Is this actually possible? Gawain nodded. In theory, yes. We should discuss this further with Heidi. She is the expert after all. Gawain and Rebecca hurried out, leaving Hummel and his apprentices staring blankly at each other. An apprentice stepped forward. Master, what do we do now? Do we still turn on the furnaces? Hummel scoffed. Of course we have to turn it on. Whether we get to eat meat tonight depends on it. The apprentices rushed to work, manually lighting the furnaces and bringing the forge to life. Manual labor would have to do for now, until Gawain's theory on magic circles could be put to the test. In the center of the base camp, Heidi stepped into Gawain's tent. There, with Rebecca and Amber, she listened to Gawain's idea. Dame Heidi shook her head. In theory, using a magic circle to power another would work, but in practice it would be too difficult to execute. The channeling of magical power from one circle to the other requires perfect precision. If something were to happen in that connection, both circles would be destroyed. This isn't even getting to the issue of efficiency. The power supplied by a magic circle the size of the garden would be insufficient for even a few magical furnaces. Gawain expected that she would have such doubts. He smiled and pushed a pile of sketches aside, unfurling a large stretch of parchment filled with symbols and lines. Take a look at this. These were drawings I sketched out a few days ago. Dame Heidi observed the magical symbols and stepped back in shock. Lord Ancestor, you know how to draw magic circles. Gawain smiled. I did not create this magic circle. Take a look first and tell me your thoughts. Heidi analyzed every symbol and carving and pattern. Her brows furrowed as she inspected it all. These are all basic symbols. Each of these matrices is at most grade 2. Gawain nodded. The person who left this magic circle could only carve grade 2 magic circles. Heidi examined the drawings, impressed. For such basic symbols to create such a large-scale magic circle, this is an incredible creation. It's self-powered, drawing magical power in the air. Her eyes widened. And the matrices at the center purify the magical power, making it more efficient in the process. This is... Dame Heidi drifted off at a total loss for words. Gawain nodded. It's a testament to hard work and years of research. It's akin to a crippled man traveling across all of Lorraine with a mere walking stick. Even an archmage would be impressed at how all these grade 2 symbols and matrices can add up to a magic circle of this caliber. Heidi smiled bitterly. I doubt it. As creative as this magic circle is, archmages won't bother with it because it is made up of only grade 2 symbols. No matter how efficient it is, it still cannot match the power archmages can output with the circles they carve. Gawain shrugged. You may be right, but this is an original design that can be improved upon constantly. What if you take this blueprint and use grade 3 symbols instead? What if the matrices and combinations were all grade 3? How much more efficient could it be then? He pointed at a few special nodes in the diagram. I believe there are more crucial aspects to this design beyond efficiency. Take a look. Heidi observed the diagram specifically where Gawain pointed. These are magic channels, are they not? I don't see what they are meant to connect to, however. Gawain nodded. It was designed to supply magical power to a human being, but if some of these symbols were changed so that it was compatible with other magic circles, do you think this design would be capable of supplying a constant source of energy to the forge? Heidi ran the hypothesis in her mind. She buzzed with excitement and her face lit up. If all of the symbols can work successfully, no, they definitely can. It will be the very extremes of theoretical calculations. I believe it will indeed work. She stepped back and looked at the diagram in its totality. It will be a highly efficient self-powering magic circle with a flexible means to transfer power out of. Beyond powering the forge, it could power even more of the territory. She turned to Gawain, dying of curiosity. Lord Ancestor, who designed this magic circle? Gawain's lips curved into a sly smile. I believe you are well acquainted with its creator. He held up a tattered notebook. It was the writings of the rogue mage, the one who had died in the woods. Gawain opened the notebook and flipped to a page. Annie, I have finally completed the magic web today. I hope that it'll be able to cure you of your disease once and for all. Heidi staggered back. Of course, the rogue mage's research. It all clicked at once for Heidi and Rebecca. Seeing the tattered notebook, Heidi finally understood the root of it all. This was the work left behind by the rogue mage. Gawain sighed. Indeed. He was a novice mage stuck at grade 2 for his entire life and looked down on by other mages. Whether it was talent or sheer hard work, his research is beyond our imagination. Gawain tapped the notebook. I pored over his notes in detail, and in my opinion, this notebook is worth at least half the title of a duke. Impossible, Heidi stammered. Gawain didn't feel it was an exaggeration. From a technological development standpoint, the writings left by the nameless rogue mage would only become more valuable as time passed. Even though the mage never got to put most of his research to practical test, a trove of revolutionary ideas existed in his notebook. And for Gawain, revolutionary ideas were the most important. Gawain placed the notebook on the table and looked at Heidi. His daughter, Annie, is likely to have suffered from elemental assimilation disease. As a mage, you should be familiar with it. Heidi nodded, grieving silently for a moment. It's a unique disease from the Violet Kingdom. The chance of catching it is low, but it is incurable. I guessed it had to be elemental assimilation when I read the journal. If magic provided wondrous benefits like unique and powerful spells, it also provided deadly dangers. At the top of these dangers was the elemental assimilation disease. Rebecca grew grim as she recounted what she knew of the ailment. These types of diseases are caused by magic seeping into the body, particularly in areas of very densely concentrated elemental power. Gawain nodded slowly. Back during the days of the Gondolian Empire, many near the Azure Fount caught elemental assimilation if they didn't cast spell shields. Even back in the golden days of the Empire, it was considered an incurable disease. Heidi picked up the rogue mage's notebook and scanned the contents a second time. From what I know, elemental assimilation only appears in newborns. It is a mutation caused by magical radiation while growing in their mother's womb. Children with this disease may grow up normally in the beginning, but as they grow older, signs of specific elemental assimilation gradually emerge. The patient's body starts to undergo changes during this process and experiences partial elemental assimilation. Their skin may turn to fire, meld with stone, dematerialize into water. Gawain closed his eyes. For the rogue mage's daughter, she was becoming consumed by the element of the shadow. Heidi grimaced. The thought of a child going through such a grotesque transformation stabbed at her heart. As their biological tissue starts to undergo elemental assimilation, the physical realm starts to reject them. The more the element overtakes them, assimilating into their body, the further they slip a realm deeper into their respective element's domain. This process would only speed up as the condition worsened. After more than half of their biological tissue had undergone elemental assimilation, they would disappear from the physical world and be pushed into the elemental dimension. For good? Gawain shook his head. No, the ailing child would die somewhere between our world and the elemental dimension. The fact that they are neither a human being nor an elemental creature keeps them in a limbo state. The human in them reaches for the physical realm. The elemental in them reaches for the elemental world. It'll feel like they're being torn apart in their final moments of consciousness. Gawain took the notebook away from Heidi and placed a tender hand on her shoulder. The rogue mage tried to bind his daughter with magical power as she slipped into the Shadow Realm. Other elemental dimensions would be easier to research compared to the Shadow Realm. He knew he had no choice but to find a cure and fast. Rebecca understood the theories behind elemental powers. It's similar to how elemental summoners use magical shackles to force an elemental being to stay in the elemental dimension. However, this is harder than binding an elemental being as elemental assimilation disease worsens, hence a need to pump in more and more magical power to counteract the whole process. Gawain nodded. A Grade 2 mage, especially one who was looked down on by the Association of Mystics, would not have the power and money to afford such an expensive treatment. So he used his own method. He sought to build an unprecedentedly efficient, self-powered magical circle. He shattered the belief that such a matrix could only power itself and designed a magic web that could charge his daughter. He was pretty much at his wit's end since he had depleted the high levels of concentrated magic in that forest. Still, he used his sheer unique intellect to solve this problem. Heidi recalled the rest of the story and frowned. But it was a sudden surge of magic that destroyed his magic circle, was it not? If this magic web cannot withstand surges of magic, isn't that a huge flaw? Gawain shook his head. It was not a magic surge that destroyed the magic web. You can see in the diagram that it has very comprehensive safety precautions. Even when we found the cabin a month later, the magic web had remained. The disaster that occurred was not because of the web of magic circles, but the shadow transformation ritual that he started. Magic binding can only slow down the process of elemental assimilation, but it cannot eradicate the root of the problem. At that time, Annie was already on the verge of losing control, hence the rogue mage conducted a very risky ritual, one that would turn them both into creatures of the shadow. In the act of performing such a dangerous ritual, they were not prepared for the sudden surge of magical power. Heidi winced imagining what that catastrophe must have been like. I still can't believe it. A rogue mage was actually capable of designing such a thing. This large-scale magical formation abandons all the semblance of complexity, using simple runes and symbols to do something extraordinary. Gawain nodded and paced around the tent. He wondered if a technical job like setting up the magical web would be more suitable for Heidi. However, Heidi was already in charge of overseeing most of the construction work at the campsite. Although she was very competent, there was still the job of building a magic laboratory waiting for her. I shouldn't continue piling more for her to do. Should I hand this responsibility to Rebecca then? Although she only knew how to release fireballs, carving magical circles was different from casting spells, especially for self-powered magical formations where she only needed to follow the blueprints and build them. This would only require a good grasp of theoretical knowledge. Yet, the fact that it was Rebecca made Gawain doubtful. Rebecca seemed to be able to read Gawain's mind because she started jumping up and down, waving her hand at her Lord Ancestor. "Give the responsibility to me. I can do it." Gawain studied her. "Are you sure? The importance of this project is far greater than you can imagine. It can be said to be a foundation, the preface to many of my plans for the future. Are you sure you can handle it?" Rebecca looked fearfully at Gawain. "If I mess up, will you throw me away?" Gawain sighed and looked at Heidi. "Forget it! Heidi, it's better for you to do it." Before Heidi could accept the task, Rebecca mustered up her courage and held her head high. "No! Let me try, I can do it!" She looked at the diagram. "This magic web, I think maybe I can." Rebecca started to stutter, but she found her wits and shouted at Gawain. "Even though I only know the fireball technique, my grasp of theory is very good. Besides, Aunt Heidi has been so busy lately and I haven't been doing anything other than assessing the soil quality and burning the wastelands. I know I can build this magic web." Gawain laughed. "Heidi, what do you think?" Heidi crossed her arms and sighed. "Rebecca is good with theory indeed, and if we don't consider casting spells, she has more innate talent than me. Of course, it would be better if she was slightly more dependable." Rebecca puffed up her cheeks. "I can be dependable." She pointed at the diagram of the magic web. In fact, I've thought about something like this a long time ago, but for spells. If I could simplify the difficult spells and make casting them easier, perhaps I could finally conjure more than just a fireball. Seeing the diagram gave me a lot of inspiration. Gawain smiled. All right then. In that case, you will handle this matter then. Rebecca was exhilarated. Really? Of course. Gawain pulled out another piece of paper from beneath his table. It was a rough draft that he drew up for the smithy. Just follow this scale, and make sure that the whole area is within the coverage of the magic web. He pointed to a section on their map. Also, have them build the first batch of furnaces here. You can get the materials necessary for making the magical circle from the vault inside the mountain. Although the scale of this magical formation is large, it is a basic one. I believe that the ready-made mage metal and the quartz sand that Sir Philip brought back from Tanzantown should be enough for you to use. Rebecca, who had been given a huge responsibility, hurried away while Heidi returned to instructing the newly arrived serfs and commoners on the construction of tents. This left only Gawain and Amber in the big tent. The half-elf sized up Gawain. "Why do you look so happy? You weren't even this happy when you took the document from that old king. Is flirting with your great-great-great-great-granddaughter so fun?" Gawain sighed. "Maybe I ought to just stab you." Amber's japes and jibes normally made Gawain want to smack the impudent half-elf on the ear. Yet this time, he wasn't frustrated at all, because he was in high spirits right now. Instead, he turned to Amber and folded his hands in front of himself. "Do you know how invaluable magic circles are?" Amber blinked. She looked at him blankly. "How invaluable they are? How should I know?" Gawain let out an involuntary guffaw. He hadn't expected the little rogue to be so forthright about her own ignorance, especially when, in his previous life, he bore witness to an internet age. No stupidity in this world could compare. "Let me rephrase the question. What if mages weren't the only ones to use magic? What if everyone could use magic? How valuable do you think that would be?" Amber stared at him, her eyes wide and jaw slack. When she regained her composure, she narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "I know you've been staring at the sun lately, but have the sunspots addled your brains? You want to make everyone a magician?" Gawain laughed. He walked over to his desk and drummed his fingers against it. No. Not turn everyone into a magic user. But with magic circles, we could give everyone access to this extraordinary power. He looked toward the tent flap, which fluttered in the gentle breeze. "I'm afraid Heidi hasn't quite realized the magic circle's true potential." Amber groaned. "I'm not Rebecca. You can't just lecture at me." Gawain held up his hand. "The rogue mage drew up a magic circle that produced a consistent output of magic. He did this so that his daughter could make use of this same power." Amber tapped her feet impatiently. She eyed her boss curiously. "Isn't it more powerful to use your own magic than to borrow some power from another?" Gawain looked into Amber's eyes. "A giant mountain ape can crush a brown bear's head with a slap, but a human can only do the same thing with the aid of a warhammer. Who do you think is more powerful?" Amber blinked. "What?" Gawain sighed. He stood and walked toward the tent flap, his mind swirling with too many thoughts to impart to his assistant. The mage's notebook was a veritable font of knowledge, with extensive research notes. He had evidently not been an ambitious fellow, and thus had to make up his shortcomings as a wizard by creating extensive theories, all of which he wrote down. Gawain was frankly astonished that someone of this world could have the foresight to detail such theories as automatic operation, compatible transmission interface, a control interface designed for dummies, rune arrangements based on geometry, and simplified rune formulae. Such thinking would probably be quashed by any of the mage guilds in Lorraine, especially since they imply that so-called undeserving people can gain access to magic. Gawain stepped out into the sun and observed the now fully functioning camp before him. The various small wooden structures and tents all gave the impression of a lively community, albeit one that still had a long way to go to rebuild one of the founding clans of this kingdom. He grinned to himself. Labourers rushing to and fro, and some young children playing among the still-standing trees, made life seem strangely normal. In spite of everything these people had been through and might be through again, little did his citizens know that he was sitting on top of a breakthrough comparable to when the first humans tied a stone to a stick to kill dangerous beasts. His mind flush with ideas, Gawain rushed to find his descendants. He needed to study. He spent the third day studying how to construct magic circles alongside Rebecca Cecil. They pored over the rogue mage's notes and attempted to recreate some of his early findings. Unfortunately, they had limited success, only causing circles to flicker with a bit of magic. Gawain suspected Heidi might be of help to them, but she was busy managing other affairs. During breaks, he rushed to organize the clearing of what would become Clan Cecil's lands. No matter what lofty plans Gawain held in his mind, he still needed to fill the stomachs of his subjects. That had to take priority. The fledgling city had food and necessities from Tanzan town, and the king had even promised to supply the territory with food and cloth for their first year. However, these were only for transitional usage, and long-term survival required self-sufficiency. Although it was not impossible to use resources from the mines to purchase grain from neighbouring lords, Gawain had a different mindset. In his previous life he was from China, and thus had the same compulsion that most Chinese people had, an obsessive compulsion to avoid a famine. As such, Gawain didn't sleep but instead drew up plans for which parts of the area would be workable farmland. Even in the dead of night, Gawain strode across the land, testing the soil by digging it up with his bare hands. All the while, Gawain's mind was buzzing with all the new facts about this world. Even after 3 months, he still struggled to understand how a world where runes enabled a simple furnace to melt metal using only straw as fuel could still be relying upon serfdom and primitive agriculture. Weirder still, he was unsure of whether or not the laws of physics applied to this world in the same way they did on Earth. He couldn't shake the notion that maybe Lauren's microscopic matter behaved in a far different way than he was used to. But whatever the intricacies, farming was farming. Gawain was certain of that much. Gawain walked over to where the land was being tilled. Everything here was still at their initial stages. The day before, Rebecca had burned away weeds and shrubs with her fireballs. The land left behind was charred but potentially usable. The farmer serfs were now digging into the soil, turning the rich ash into the ground, removing stones, rocks and debris as well. Gawain was delighted to see the performance of his orders here. Every 100 paces, the serfs placed a wooden plaque into the ground in order to separate the plots. The labourers worked within the boundaries of their plots, while several other groups of people traversed across the ground in preparation to excavate ditches. On the edge of the reclaimed land, a temporary wooden shed had been set up, and this was where Heidi and the overseers stayed to keep track of progress, inventory of tools and the like. As Gawain walked up, many of the labourers were standing around a simmering pot, each taking turns to put their lunch in a wooden bowl. They greeted him as he walked up, but none of them really seemed surprised. They'd gotten used to the fact that their eccentric lord was always walking around construction sites, and even making a point to talk to the workers, no matter if they were covered in mud or not. At first this made them nervous, but they had gradually gotten used to it. Gawain had even made sure to reward these hard-working labourers. Gawain walked past the labourers until he arrived at the shed at the edge of the field. Within the shed, Dame Heidi was sitting at a table, conversing with a standing person who Gawain did not recognise, with Sir Philip standing by. Gawain knocked on the doorframe. Even though he didn't need to, it wasn't like the others would miss his over 6-foot frame appearing. Heidi stood. The person with whom she had been discussing turned as well. Seeing who it was, he hastily bowed. "Your lordship." Gawain waved away the deference. "Don't be nervous. I'm just checking in." He had a look at the person to whom Heidi had been talking. He had a skinny frame, but with his rough hands, coarse face and tanned skin, Gawain was sure that he was a farmer, possibly 40 or 50, depending on how much working in the fields had prematurely aged him. "Are you an expert in farming?" The man shook his head. "I am no expert. I'm just a humble farmer." Heidi turned to her ancestor. This is Norris. He's particularly skilled at farming. I needed someone to answer questions about clearing and farming the land. He has been more than capable. Norris the farmer rolled his neck nervously under Gawain's gaze and smiled humbly. However, it was this humble smile that startled Gawain a little. How long has it been since I had seen such a smile on the faces of the poor in this world? Gawain, Dame Heidi and the farmer Norris stood facing each other in the shed. Sir Philip lingered in the corner. Like most commoners in the Anzu kingdom, Norris was fearful of dealing with nobles. Even though Gawain and Viscountess Rebecca were friendly enough, Norris knew all too well how capricious the nobility could be. Generational behavior cannot change overnight. But even though Norris looked wary, Gawain noticed something special in Norris's eyes. He was nervous, timid, humble, reverent, but not apathetic. Underneath wrinkles accumulated from years of labor, there was still a lively glimmer in those sunken eyes. He nodded to himself. No wonder Heidi picked him to discuss with. How's the land? Norris extended 3 fingers and made a circular gesture over his chest. Gawain recognized it as some sort of prayer, though the significance eluded him. May Eve bless this place. I never thought that there could be arable land in the Dark Range. The terrain is flat. The water is easy to access. The soil is very fertile, and there aren't many stones in the ground to hinder our efforts. There is really no better place to open up for agriculture. Now that we are halfway through harvest month, it is too late to grow rice, but we can plant sweetwood roots and fire leaves. By planting the sweetwood roots in the soil over winter, a good harvest can be obtained in the coming spring. Fire leaves can be planted beside the sweetwood roots. With the fertility of the sweetwood roots, the fire leaves would be able to grow very quickly, and we can harvest them once before fog month this year. Next spring, the rhizomes of the fire leaves and the vines of sweetwood roots will decompose and become fertilizer. With that, we can grow grains. As long as the rain can keep up, everyone could be well fed. Norris's monologue made Gawain's head spin. It seemed, based on his answer, that agriculture was just as primitive in this world as smithing. Unfortunately, even a legendary hero didn't know everything, and Gawain found that the former Gawain Cecil knew little of agriculture. Thus, he had to rely on Norris's expertise. The longer Norris spoke, the more he relaxed, clearly in his element, talking about plants and the methods to harvest them. At the end, the old farmer added, these are the yields that we can obtain by using the plant fertilizers in addition to the land's original fertility. This way of farming would deplete the land's fertility quickly. Thus, we should rest the land every 2 to 3 years. Gawain frowned. What? Resting the land? Is there no way to increase production while maintaining the land's fertility? Norris opened his mouth to respond, but Heidi cut in. It would be best to contact the Church of the 3 Goddesses. The priests could make sacrifices to Eve, the goddess of harvest, Flora, the goddess of spring, and Gaia, the goddess of life. Her gaze grew distant. They have quite skilled clergy, yet most of their places of worship are in the plains of the Holy Spirits, close to St. Soniel. She winced. The south has never been a food-producing area, so our ancestors didn't think to put shrines to the goddesses of nature near here. Sir Philip chimed in. Beg your pardon, Dame Heidi, but there is a small church to Gaia in Tanzan town. Perhaps the priests there could be of help. We used to send messengers to Tanzan every few years from our old home to bless the land. Heidi shook her head. I already looked into it. The main priestess there is on a pilgrimage this year. She won't be back for another year. Gawain frowned slightly. He never thought that proposed solutions would involve gods. He knew that there were many gods and churches in this world. He had witnessed wars of religion happen as he had floated in the sky. Although he could not hear anything, he could easily tell what was going on just by looking at all kinds of religious symbols and the many churches and temples present. Lauren had undergone many changes, civilizations reshuffled, dynasties rising and falling, yet somehow religions still continued to tangle themselves around mortals like vines. However, as a transmigrator who had been hovering over the sky for many years, Gawain naturally maintained an attitude of keeping a respectful distance from gods. It was not that he was so stubborn to the point that he would firmly reject the notion of gods in a fantastical world like this. He had already bore witness to more magic than he had ever seen in his previous life. His two great-great-great-great-great-granddaughters could even cast huge fireballs. Moreover, there were also those priests who were proficient in real rituals. Thus, it would be futile for him to reject the notion of divinity offhandedly. Even still, he was uncomfortable with the idea of putting fate in the hands of entities that transcended mortal knowledge. Gawain Cecil had lived for 35 years. During this time, he witnessed priests performing rituals. It was a kind of power totally different from magic. There was no need to chant incantations or skills. Instead, it required a pious heart and a lifestyle that strictly adhered to varying religious disciplines. By using these methods, like practicing self-restraint and following rituals, humans would be able to use divine, supernatural power. He remembered reading somewhere that all the religions of this world originated from a sacred stone tablet, which had been shattered at some point during the first settlement. There were a few churches that held the broken fragments of this tablet. They were called the Central Sects. But even with his memories as a transmigrator, as well as Gawain's original memories, he held no memory of ever seeing a god. Perhaps I might have seen one in the sky. Shaking his head, Gawain decided these questions were better left for later. He would adopt a stance of 3 parts respect and 7 parts skepticism about these gods. Until he was able to study them, that is. If we can't count on the 3 goddesses of nature, is there any other way to solve the problem of increasing production? Dame Heidi waggled her head back and forth. She looked down at her desk and read through some figures she had jotted down earlier. She tapped the book triumphantly with her forefinger. To be honest, with the progress we're making, and given the first year of food guaranteed by King Francis, we're not short at all. There are only 870-odd people living in the territory. We can feed all of them. Gawain strode over to the door of the shed. He gazed out up the mountains, his eyes following the twisting, turbulent clouds in the sky. We won't always be only 870. I was hoping we could attract pioneers here and purchase serfs as needed. Heidi furrowed her brow, but she didn't question it. Gawain nodded. She still didn't understand the value of people. Norris watched thoughtfully, then spoke up. We could ask the Druids for help. Sir Philip, Heidi and Gawain all turned to look at the peasant, suddenly so bold. Norris shrunk slightly under their gazes. He cleared his throat. Their alchemical potions and magics can help protect the soil. From his downcast eyes, it looked like the farmer wanted nothing more than to blow away in the wind. Gawain rushed up to him and seized him by the shoulders. Norris, what an idea! Fantastic! The others jumped, startled by Gawain's positive outburst. Norris grinned awkwardly. Gawain realized he had overstepped and released the old farmer. He brushed off the man's shoulders and hastily pursued the question. Where can we find them? Heidi clicked her tongue. We don't know. Our clan typically hasn't had dealings with druids. We could search the mosswoods far in the east, but that's prohibitively far away. Gawain growled, his excitement melting quickly into frustration. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to recall everything he knew about druids. How could we find them? Druids have always been close to elves. In fact, almost every druid legacy can be traced back to elves, including grey elves and sylvan elves. Heidi's gaze suddenly fixed on something behind Gawain. What about half-elves? The others turned and looked out the door. Standing just outside the shed was Amber, kicking her shoes about. Her eyes widened. She looked away. I'm sorry, but I won't be of much use. Gawain sighed. Of course. Amber was a disgrace of an elf, so it was no use expecting anything from her, she continued. After all, I only know one druid. The others froze. Amber winked at Gawain. As soon as Amber's voice fell, Gawain turned his head and stared at her fixedly. A chill went up the half-elf's spine. What's with that look of yours? Gawain tilted his head with a growing frown. How would you know a druid? Amber set her arms akimbo. Why can't I know a druid? I'm a half-elf, okay? All the druid factions in the world originated from elves, don't you know? The words would have convinced Gawain if they had come from anyone else with pointed ears. Amber was a flat-out disgrace to her kind. He thought of the only possibility in which Amber could know a druid. You mean you know a druid in the sense that you stole something from one and they tried to chase and kill you? Amber stomped the ground angrily. How can you insult me like that? How would anyone catch me stealing? Gawain nursed a growing headache. Amber, meanwhile, cleared her throat and placed her hand on her chest. Let me tell you, this guy I know is not just a druid, but a scholarly druid. He knows a bit of everything. He belongs to the Forest Heart Druid faction. He is particularly good at dealing with plants and animals. He is absolutely reliable. Gawain decided not to probe further about how Amber knew this druid. He held a finger. Can you still reach him? Gawain held up a second finger. If so, how long will it take to bring him here? Amber crossed her arms and tapped her feet excitedly. It's easy for me to reach him. Most people say druids are hard to find, but this fella operates mainly in the southern borders. As for how long it'll take to bring him here, I can shadow walk to get to him, but if I'm to bring him along on the way back, I'm afraid we'll only be able to walk. It'll depend on whether we can get our hands on horses or something. Gawain's eyes narrowed. Don't try to steal horses. With the wave of his hand, he placed a few coins in her palm. Buy yourself new shoes or horses instead. Amber grinned. You should also give me some money to give the druid as a down payment. Even if we're acquaintances, you still have to pay him, okay? Gawain grabbed more gold and silver and handed them to Amber. Take it. Get it done. Whatever remains is all yours. Amber's eyes shone with the reflection of the gold and silver. She snatched and pocketed the glistening treasures at once. The mint was not yet ready, so Cecil currency was still merely a concept. Gawain had asked the craftsman to reduce some gold and silver into smaller pieces for trading. While coins became the standard, people of this world would not turn people away if they showed up to buy things with gold and silver chunks. It added an additional process of inspection and calculation, but at the end of the day, gold was gold. Silver was silver. As Amber skipped away happily, Heidi could not help but worry. She's not going to run away with those pieces of gold and silver, is she? Gawain sighed. At this juncture, we should have at least some trust in her. We don't have a choice anyways. Of course, Gawain still worried. It would totally be in Amber's character to run off and never return, but he had no choice. After Amber left, Gawain turned his attention back to the issue of the cultivation of the land. Norris, the old farmer, had kept his head down quietly and waited all this time. Gawain turned to him. Are there any other problems in this land? It is best to bring up any problems that might arise as early as possible. Norris thought about it, then pointed to the riverbank. If I must say, the land along the riverbank is higher than the fields. This would make it hard for the water to be channeled into canals. We would have to dig ditches from upstream. But by the same token, during torrential rains, we don't have to worry about flooding of the crops. Gawain nodded and retreated to his thoughts. If there was a pump or some lifting machinery, this would be an easy problem to solve. Or perhaps we can find a mage specializing in the element of water to assist with the irrigation. This would be unreliable, of course. Not even the pile of treasures the Cecil territory had stashed away could entice mages and elves to spend their time irrigating crops. They would rather take no money at all to set off fireworks and do magic shows for the king or for the other dukes. Asking Heidi to try would only add even more responsibilities on her shoulders. Gawain sighed. Unless I want to put more burden on the serfs, the only solution is a mechanical one then. A light bulb went off in Gawain's head. Of course! He spun around to Heidi, Norris and Sir Philip. Have any of you heard of the water wheel? The three shared a look. Sure enough, none of them had heard of such a thing. Gawain asked for a pen and paper and began to make a simple sketch. He drew a tall, wheel-like structure supported by spokes. Wooden boards and inclined drums were fixed to the outer edge of the wheel. He crudely drew a water channel beneath the wheel. It was a rough drawing, but it would have to do for now. Hasn't the water wheel existed in Earth's history for centuries? How is it that this world knows nothing of it? Just as Gawain pondered that question, he came to a conclusion. Of course, it must be because of magic. The existence of magic makes certain technologies obsolete. Why invent something like the magic wheel when there are elves and mages capable of changing the flow of a river with a single spell? Why craft new weapons when a simple sword can be enchanted with magic and thus made equally powerful, if not more powerful, than a rifle? Gawain did not have the luxury of several mages at his disposal, ready to help build out his new territory. That meant that in this world of magic, he would have to innovate. Gawain pointed at the wheel. This thing is a water wheel. The river flows underneath, pushing these wooden boards and driving the rotation of the wheel. The water wheel carries the water-filled drums to the top, and the water is poured into a channel on the top, where the water will flow to the crops. This results in water being raised to a higher ground. How high it can go depends on how big the water wheel is. As long as the materials are strong enough, this process should go on forever. This, of course, is just a sketch. But the principle is very simple, and many different models can be built based upon this principle. Heidi's eyes widened as she observed the drawing. The mechanical construct was so simple, yet did exactly what they needed most. It would not need serfs working around the clock to keep it powered, nor did it require a painstaking amount of construction. Gawain sighed. Unfortunately, there is no bamboo here. Otherwise it would be much easier to build. Heidi frowned. What? What did you say? Bamboo? Gawain dismissed the thought. Nothing. Does anyone have any thoughts about this contraption? Heidi was about to call it a stroke of genius when Norris picked up the quill and drew something on a blank piece of paper. If we were to set it directly on the riverbank of the White River, it would be prone to the river's conditions. During the dry season, the water level would be too low. If another channel could be dug, Norris looked up, noticing the sudden silence around him. He stepped back and lowered his head apologetically. I'm sorry, Lord, I was only trying to help. I apologize if I overstepped. Gawain furrowed his brows. He wasn't mad, but something about Norris's actions piqued his curiosity. Norris only backed away, fearing the Grand Duke's wrath. Gawain picked up the quill that Norris dropped. Norris, can you write? Norris staggered back some more. He was ready to be reprimanded, and did not expect such a specific query to be thrown his way. The old farmer did not know how to respond. Would he suffer some kind of punishment if he answered incorrectly? Had he perhaps broken a law he hadn't known about? Norris brought his hands together apologetically. At the last second he chose honesty, for to lie would only double his punishment. Yes, my lord, I learned to read and write. Gawain nodded slowly. It was just as he expected. Although Norris had only drawn a simple sketch, Gawain noticed how he held the quill. Heidi looked at Norris, a little surprised. It seemed that she hadn't noticed. To Norris's relief, Gawain did not draw his sword to slash off his head. Instead, the Grand Duke smiled. Don't worry. Being literate isn't a violation of the law. Teaching others to read and write isn't a violation either. Who taught you? Norris bashfully stroked the back of his own head. My lord, you might laugh at this, but I once served in the Church of the Harvest. I learned to read and write from a teacher back then, and almost became a priest. Gawain raised an eyebrow. His curiosity piqued. A son of a farmer nearly became a priest? I have to know more. Though he was encouraging Norris to share, the old farmer grew squeamish with the Cecil lord observing so intently. I'm from a family of freemen who lived in the Cecil territory for generations. We made do with a few small plots of land. It was enough to make sure my family never went hungry or cold in the winter. As a kid, the farm was all I knew. I worked in the fields with my father and my uncles. I kneaded dough and baked vegetable buns with my mothers and aunts and sisters. Gawain smiled, reminded that the majority of people in this world were like Norris. Without technology, people lived in small circles. Farmers remained farmers all their lives, as the feudal system made it impossible for anyone outside of aristocratic families to gain power. Norris continued, But when I was 8, a harvest goddess priest from the plains of the Holy Spirit came to the Cecil territory on a missionary trip and resided in the village where I lived. To us farmers, it was an incredibly rare opportunity to see these priests stay. Everyone in the village gathered their money, and in accordance with the rules of the 3 goddesses of fertility, the village elder presented numerous gifts in the hope that the priests would bless the village with a bountiful harvest. Norris smiled. I still remember what the priest said to me. This child will bring blessings to the land. He is favored by the goddess of harvest. With that, my parents sold everything they could, scraped together all the money with help from the village, and begged the old knight of the village for a travel pass to Tanzan town, where the Church of the Goddesses of Nature resided. It was just barely enough, so I left to become an apprentice. Though this was decades ago, the old farmer vividly remembered the days. My parents were so proud. I left the village as a hero. No one else had left the farming town for good for generations. As you may know, there are 3 sects of nature goddesses. The goddess of nature was, of course, the most revered, but there was also the goddess of harvest and the goddess of spring. Candidates for priesthood received the same teachings, so I joined the Church of the Nature Goddess in Tanzan town. There, I studied for 5 years. Norris's reminiscing smile faded. And after 5 years, I received an appraisal from the higher church. This apprentice does not have the spiritual gift for the goddesses of fertility. A messenger had sent the same result to my hometown, but because no one knew how to read, they didn't know what the letter said at all. They found out, of course, when I returned to the village with the same little belongings I left with. The older farmer's shoulders sagged. Sorrow and joy left his face, leaving only a calmness in his deeply set eyes. Time, it seemed, had dulled the pain of rejection, of letting down his family and his village. The next few years were difficult. Sending me away put my family in constant accumulating debt. My father, he did not survive that winter, but the debts did not die with him. We still had to repay it all. It was my responsibility. Heidi looked away. Hearing her people suffer sent icicles stabbing into her heart. Norris smiled feebly. My mother took me and my sister to visit the Viscount. At that time, it was Lady Rebecca's father. We knelt on our knees and begged for help, and to our deepest gratitude, the Viscount showed benevolence. He waived the field tax and lent us seeds. That year I toiled the fields until my hands were covered in blisters. With an exceptionally good crop yield of vegetables, we managed to survive. He sighed. After that, I worked the land honestly and helped anyone with odd jobs. If people asked for 2 or 3 people, I took on the job myself. Whenever merchants arrived, I helped calculate prices and weights. My ability to read and perform basic arithmetics came in handy. In that way, my family gradually paid off the debt. Norris lifted his head, filled with a quiet pride. In the year my mother died, our family was well enough to have a feast of meat. Heidi shook her head. I never knew this happened in our territory. We've done our best to give alms, but... Gawain cut her off. Alms don't do enough because they don't solve the problem at its root. It's hard to see it growing up inside the castle. He looked at Norris. So, after all this time, do you still believe in the goddess of harvest? Norris nodded. I do. I believe she was the one who ensured that we were able to pay off our debts. All farmers believe in the goddess of harvest, I reckon. Gawain looked at him quietly. Even after you suffered so much because of this belief. Norris lowered his head. It's my own lousy life, my lord. How can I blame it on the gods? I learned some things in my time at least, even if reading and writing were not very useful for farming. Gawain placed a firm hand on the old man's shoulder. Knowing how to read and write will not be useless. Norris, you have good farming skills, right? Norris held his head high. I dare not claim any other achievements, my lord. But when it comes to farming, I can stake my life on it. He showed his hands callous to the point that they felt like sandpaper. Gawain nodded. You are also literate in language and numbers with education from the church. The rules and forms that Heidi gave out to all the commoners and serfs. You understand all of them, right? If I were to ask you to fill them out and calculate harvested yield, would you be able to do it? Norris nodded, then summoned the courage to look Gawain in the eye. My lord, are you going to let me be a supervisor? Norris knew that the old supervisors who brandished whips were useless for the lord's new labour system. He required people who could read and write, but Gawain shook his head. No, you will not be a supervisor. I want you to manage the whole process of opening up land for agriculture and all of food production if you think you can do it. Norris's expression froze in shock. My lord, I don't quite understand. Are you making me a chamberlain? But chamberlains don't only manage food. Gawain laughed. No! This is not a lowly chamberlain role. If I had to give it a name, it would be agricultural manager. It is not a title you can pass from generation to generation. It is a title earned through merit and talent. You won't have it permanently either. If you do not perform up to standard, or if you violate Cecil law using your position of power, you will be removed and punished. He turned to Heidi. This goes for every position we establish from here on out. Does everyone understand? Norris gave it serious consideration. Then he looked up and gave a confident nod. I said I would stake my life on my agricultural experience, my lord. If you trust me, I will take care of anything you assign me. I will ensure that the Cecil territory will have bountiful harvests from today until the end of time. Norris's determination filled the room with a palpable air of triumph. Gawain grinned. He knew that Norris didn't quite comprehend the meaning of his new title, or even how the administration would work. He was still slightly confused, but Gawain let him relish his victory. Let him enjoy having an elevated state, for the work will begin soon, and he will need the determination. Besides, Gawain's new order would be more than any could imagine, not just Norris. Even Heidi and Rebecca would likely struggle to understand it, a suspicion that was quickly confirmed by Gawain glancing over at Dame Heidi. The Cecil aristocrat stood there stoically with tightly pursed lips. She had a lot to say, but was waiting for the right time to say it. Gawain clapped Norris on the shoulder. Good man! Off with you now. We will have word soon enough about the state of things. Norris bowed and exited the shed. Once he had left, Heidi spoke. Ancestor, do you really intend for him to manage the clan's fields? Gawain smiled amiably. Facing backlash from this world's more conservative sect was a problem he anticipated. However, with a memory of the satellite's alarm ringing in his ears, he knew his time was limited. The dark wave fast approached, and he couldn't worry about offending Dame Heidi or those of her station with even less understanding. Yes, is there anything the matter with that? Heidi rested her hand on the windowsill and nervously drummed her fingers. The fingertips of her white gloves were now turning slightly brown due to travel and work. She could only clean them with magic so often. He is literate, yes, but he also... Heidi turned toward Gawain and froze in her tracks. Gawain knew she was about to say that he was poor, then realized the tactlessness of that statement. He also lacks some required knowledge. He doesn't know the rules of the upper class. He might bring his peasant understanding to his management style and get into trouble for no reason. Gawain took a glance toward the doorway. Sir Philip lounged against the doorframe, at attention but slightly relaxed. He leaned toward Heidi and murmured, What upper class are you referring to? Heidi stammered and stuttered. Well, the upper class. Gawain gestured out the window. Look, there's nothing out here. We're in unclaimed territory. There is no upper class here, no aristocratic etiquette. Those are old-world ideas. They were burned with the scorched earth of the old Cecil territory. Let them go. That way we can start from scratch. Heidi sat down, staring blankly out the window. The land was being worked by farmers, but there was no towering castle in the distance, no ramshackle houses. The camp was being constructed in order to make sure everyone was clean and fed. Efficiency was the priority. There were no rules preventing peasants from building houses in a way that offended the castle. There were no noble estates that had to be built away from poorer ones. She vaguely understood what Gawain meant, but the prospect frightened her. I understand, Ancestor, but the aristocracy exists for a reason. We provide order. We give people a sense of purpose. We cannot throw all that away. Gawain looked at Dame Heidi. He knew that her traditional aristocratic views were not deep-seated. After all, though she was a noble, her clan was very much in decline, which put her in a strange liminal space as an aristocrat. Cecil clan had been excluded from the core circle of nobles in recent generations. Thus, they would become more and more unlike aristocrats. He had even seen Heidi help personally with construction, which was unusual for someone of her station. It was just her ingrained mindset that was the problem. Gawain nodded. He sat down across from her. So you have concerns of a poor farmer running all the fields, as a manager? Well, do you know what the ancestor of Clan Baldwin used to do, before he was Grand Duke of the West? Heidi cocked her head in confusion. She blinked several times. In the history books, the Baldwin ancestors were in charge of steelworks, and their head was the Iron General of the expedition force. Gawain snapped his fingers and pointed at Dame Heidi. Exactly! He was nothing more than a blacksmith. One with the strength of a giant, granted, but a blacksmith nevertheless. He was just lucky enough to grow up during the Northern Expedition. He leaned back in his seat. What do you think I used to do? Heidi shook her head vaguely, clearly put off by the knowledge that the original Grand Duke of the West came from a commoner. Gawain leaped to his feet. Come with me! The two of them exited the shed and walked by the fields. Farmers were working hard, planting seeds, yet none so hard as to break themselves. When they were tired, they took a break, and when their tasks were completed, they went to help others. They all bowed to Dame Heidi and Gawain as they passed. Sir Philip walked behind them at a distance. Heidi cleared her throat. All they said about you is that you were a knight among knights, the first of all the great knights. Gawain laughed. Yes, it was true enough, but before that I was a squire. I had only just learned my first combat skills, and before my knight could write a recommendation to have me knighted in turn, he got drunk on his horse and tumbled into a river. He drowned. So I wrote the recommendation letter myself and used the knight's seal to stamp it. Then I brought it to the Lord. Heidi stared at Gawain, jaw slack. Gawain shrugged. But before I could deliver it, the dark wave broke out, and the Lord was slain. That's when I met Charlie, who was leading an escape. He asked to bring me with him, and I told him I was only a squire. That's when he said perhaps the wisest words I had ever heard. Gawain paused dramatically. Heidi nodded. What words were those? He grinned and winked at her. The lords of the south are all dead. Let us name ourselves knights. Heidi gasped. Gawain couldn't quite tell if she was scandalized, thrilled, or a little bit of both. You could do that? Gawain shrugged. Whether we could or not, it's what we did. We were a ragtag group of blacksmiths, artisans, carpenters, farmers, and all sorts of vagabonds one day, and the next we were pioneering knights. Gawain put his hand on Heidi's shoulder, stopping her. Look, it comes to this. Noble bloodlines have to start somewhere. Anzú was established by a bunch of peasants, just like our land now is being established by whoever survived the attack of a few months ago. That's why we need new rules. Dame Heidi winced. I do understand what you're saying, but for it to come to pass, I can't imagine what that future would look like. Gawain nodded. Yes, I think dropping all this on you at once may have been unwise. But I believe you agree with my ideas here, yes? Of course. Heidi almost cut him off in her agreement. You saved us. You made our survival possible. Gawain bowed, humbled by her assertion. Well, I promise you this then. Everything I do will be for the express purpose of bringing prosperity to the land, I swear it. Dame Heidi nodded vigorously. Gawain clapped his hands, and the pair of them began to make their way across the fields back towards the shed. In the distance, the camp hummed with activity. Then let's get back to the issue of management, the issue of letting normal citizens be involved in helping the territory run. Heidi blinked. You have more positions prepared. Is that necessary? Gawain chuckled. Look at yourself, Dame Heidi. Heidi took a look down at herself. It wasn't only her gloves that were worn from work. Her robes were torn and dirty, and her face was haggard with deep circles around her eyes. Though her beauty and grace still shone through, Heidi was clearly overworked to the point that one could hardly recognize her as the elegant dame of Clan Cecil. She winced. I have been working hard lately, but once we've established the camp, we can operate normally. Gawain nodded. Yes, you have. But even the most talented noble cannot manage internal affairs all by themselves. Have you ever done demographic statistics, production surveying, economic analysis? Have you any experience in purchasing, sales, or storage? Heidi's eyes spun as Gawain threw term after term at her. He chuckled awkwardly. It's hard enough managing a census for 800 people. Hopefully one day we will have 8,000 people, or 80,000. Could you do all that work by yourself? Heidi's face was blanker than a fresh sheet of parchment. Gawain kept speaking. In order to keep the territory functioning, you will need assistance, a whole management team. That will need to involve the citizens. By this point, they had returned to the shed. Heidi rushed over to her notebook and began scrawling down notes. All of a sudden, she stopped. But most of our civilians can't write as much as their own name. How can they possibly be expected to administer? She took a sip of water. Gawain grimaced. Here goes nothing. That's the next stage of my plan. We'll teach them to read. Heidi spat out a mouthful of water in astonishment. She stared at Gawain, flabbergasted. Gawain took a step back. He knew it would take time for her to get used to the idea. He looked over at Sir Philip. The knight was staring awkwardly out, with a stoic face. But in the pinched line of his mouth, and how intently he was focusing on the farmers, Gawain could tell that Philip had heard it too, and was likewise shocked. Gawain himself walked out of the shed and gazed into the distance. The smell of cooking meat drifted in their direction, indicating that it was almost time for lunch. He smiled. Results could not be obtained overnight. It would take time to establish a new order. To build a full society would be even more difficult, and to build a kingdom on top of that would probably take many more years. There were only 80 people in the territory now. It was true that Heidi managed to deal with it on her own. Perhaps with Rebecca, who was not quite competent, there could be fireballs to liven things up, and clear the wasteland or whatnot. But if they wanted to work towards the long-term plan, there were some foundations that must be established step by step from now on. Dame Heidi leaned on the desk, her head swirling with thoughts. She didn't expect her 700-year-old ancestor to have so many intricate plans. She felt she was doomed to fail to understand any of his plans, as they seemed so remote and grand as to elude comprehension. But she couldn't argue with how well it had affected their new settlement. Heidi beheld a new sight of joy every time she glanced out the window. His presence had changed the very fabric of how their clan functioned, and for the better. A land built from scratch, an entirely new order, a promising future. Heidi did not feel like an established mage, a dame, and an aristocrat. She felt like a teenage girl just seeing her first glimpses of a new world. It was an intimidating prospect, and an exciting one. She stood and followed Gawain to the door. He still stood there, arms folded, observing the progress of the farms. Sir Philip stood off to the side, impassive. She coughed slightly. It is a lot to take in, Grand Duke, but I see the sense of it. Gawain looked back at her. He smiled. Good. If you can, would you mind keeping quiet about what I told you today? Not everyone's as open-minded as you are. The civilians will understand, but if word makes its way to the rest of the aristocracy, they might consider us lunatics or even deadly enemies. Heidi clenched her teeth. I will hold my tongue. It's easy enough for us to want change when our house has fallen into disgrace. But since other houses are flush with wealth and majesty, I reckon they would not care to change. After a moment, another thought crossed Heidi's mind. Must I keep this secret from Rebecca? It might be hard for her to understand as well. Gawain laughed. You have done well educating her, but I think you underestimate her. She's smarter than you think. She just needs the right outlet. Yesterday, I saw her. Gawain's voice trailed off. Heidi followed his gaze and saw what he did. A little shadow appeared just over a hill running up to them. Dame Heidi squinted. It's Betty! The little maid sprinted up to them. She skidded to a halt before Gawain and Heidi, then spoke. My lord the Viscountess Rebecca is looking for you. Gawain held up his hand. Whoa, Betty! Slow down! Breathe! Betty did so, panting. She wiped her brow and gulped. She laughed a bit in embarrassment, then continued. My lord, the Viscountess Rebecca is looking for you. Gawain and Heidi exchanged a quick look. What does she want? Gawain stopped himself mid-sentence. Oh, I'm sorry. I know you must have forgotten. Betty threw her arm up in the air triumphantly. Not this time. She says it's about to start, and she wants you there to see what happens. Heidi furrowed her brow. What's about to start? Betty opened her mouth eagerly to respond, then stopped. Her eyes stared out blankly. I don't know. I forgot. Dame Heidi groaned. Gawain chuckled. I know what it is. He patted Betty's head. Well done. Rebecca has been working on magic circles for a few days. It looks like she might be ready to get one working. Heidi nodded knowingly. Gawain held out his hand. Why not come with me? There's nothing urgent to settle in the fields, so let's see how Rebecca's first project has turned out. Heidi took Gawain's hand and stepped out onto the ground. Very well then. To be honest, I'm a little worried about her. She can make fireballs, but for a mage of her limitations to create a large-scale magic circle is worrisome. She turned to Sir Philip. I'm off to the smithy. Sir Philip, you're in charge here until I return. Sir Philip straightened his back and patted his chest in a salute, though it wasn't as impressive since he had removed his metal armour. Yes, madam. Gawain and Heidi departed, heading toward the smithy. Betty stood there for a moment and looked around. The farmers were still working in the fields. Lunch had started its preparations, but she needed to rest before returning. She poked inside the wooden shack. Sir Philip rolled his eyes and followed the curious maid. Betty observed Heidi's table and looked at her notebook, which had all sorts of diagrams and notes written on it. Sir Philip folded his arms, keeping an eye on her. He knew that if the maid broke or misplaced anything important, it could be bad for him. Betty examined Gawain's sketch of a water wheel, but after not understanding the drawing, she moved on. She noticed a stack of blank pages next to Heidi's desk. She pointed. May I write? Her big eyes looked up at Sir Philip. The knight cocked his head. Can you write? I don't know. I've never tried. Sir Philip sighed. Then you can't. That's how writing works. Can you read? Betty looked out thoughtfully. I've never yet tried that either. Sir Philip strode over and removed the pile of parchment from the maid's reach. Then you're not allowed to touch them. They are important tools, not toys. Betty paused. She looked downward and nodded. Okay. Sir Philip winced at himself. He thought he had been a little too harsh on Betty. But if you want something to play with, we can draw on the ground using sticks. Betty looked up. Her face was still sad, but the idea of drawing on the ground pleased her, so Sir Philip brought her outside. The two of them lay on their bellies and scratched little drawings on the ground. Philip drew pictures of knights and drawings of stories. As they sketched together, Sir Philip couldn't help but remember what Gawain had told Dame Heidi. To teach them to read and write. To teach everyone to read and write. Could this really happen? Was it really possible? Would they really do it? If they really did it, then the little maid would be able to write too. In the meantime, Betty drew a dragon. Upon his arrival at the smithy, Gawain was surprised to see everything around him. Many construction workers rushed around the building, digging holes, and others seemed to guard specific corners. It appeared that Rebecca had transformed this into another construction site. In the middle of it all stood the Viscountess, holding a bunch of papers in her hand. She spoke to old Hummel, while the old blacksmith and his apprentices listened intently. Rebecca's eyes snapped up. She saw Gawain and a grin split her face. Lord Ancestor! Then a bit of fear clouded her grin. And Aunt Heidi? Gawain nodded to himself. Rebecca was quite in awe of Aunt Heidi, and obviously her presence made her a little more nervous. Dame Heidi smiled her austere smile at her niece. I've come to see your progress. Worry not, I didn't abandon the camp for you, my pet. Looks like you're feeling confident in yourself. Rebecca nodded eagerly. Yes, I've been working on this for a few days. Gawain could tell Rebecca's eyes were underscored with dark circles. Like her aunt, she had not slept much. And these rune formulas are so easy to adapt. Heidi held up her hand, interrupting her niece. Wait, we know you're good at calculation and theory, Rebecca. Just tell us how you intend to complete the magic circle. Rebecca's grin widened. She giggled. Then she seemed to realize the importance of this task. So she straightened herself up. All right, I'm going to bury it underground. Heidi gasped. What? She rushed over to the labourers. The workers immediately straightened up when Heidi drew near. Gawain followed, Rebecca at his heels. What I've been doing, Ancestor, is drawing the lines of the runes out, and then I'll have the labourers dig where I draw. Then I'll place the magic circle within. Gawain nodded, and the two of them reached Aunt Heidi, who was staring at a newly dug ditch. Gawain folded his arms. What's wrong with burying the magic circle underground, Heidi? Heidi stammered. Well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that most magic circles are exposed so that they're easy to operate. Also, it's twice as much work to bury it. Yet something was nagging at Gawain, something that Heidi didn't pick up on. As far as he knew, geometry wasn't a commonly taught course in this world, and they didn't have any technology to look from a bird's eye view. So Rebecca's task seemed even more daunting in that light. Rebecca had drawn a magic circle full of geometric shapes with high precision on a plane up to 100 meters in diameter, using only her naked eyes. Gawain scratched his head. "How did you draw it out on the ground so precisely?"